it was a new tone of office, and it was not just stylistic. It was not just because of the gender of the chief executive. It was because there was a sense very early on, and it really was born of the campaign, that there would be fundamental changes in the way that we approached government and problems and governing. And as Pete said, it publicly at least began at the Room G in the Ramada Inn, but it really carried over to the very first inaugural speech. This was an opportunity for the governor to really begin to keep her promises. And the economic tax cut first and foremost, it was a substantive economic policy, but it also was a promise to the electorate that who had become fairly cynical, that there would be a governor, a politician, who would make a promise and keep it. And keeping that promise it became, in my view at least, almost as important as the substance behind the tax cut itself. Because the economy, as the dean would tell us, is a very complex thing, and it's not just a matter of cutting taxes or creating jobs, but it's also creating the mindset and the public confidence and the consumer confidence and the business confidence to communicate that New Jersey indeed was open for business. So the governor's first opportunity to do this was an inaugural address. And now looking back at it, I didn't fully appreciate this at the time when the speech was getting drafted and so forth. The inaugural address turned out to be one of the most substantive inaugural addresses that any governor up to that point had ever given. If you go back and read the first Whitman inaugural address, it almost reads like a budget address. It is very, very specific. And indeed, Tom Kean was asked. It was quoted in the paper the very next day that it was the most substantive speech he had ever given, ever heard a governor give at an inaugural. And I think that says something very strong and very powerful about the tone of this administration. It was going to be substantive, it was going to be serious, it was going to be tied back to economic policies and promises made, and this was a governor who was going to keep those promises. It also was a governor who had to, maneuver is not the right word, it's not the right word, but be effective with her legislative partners. And there also was the opportunity in the inaugural address, and she surprised just about everybody. And she announced that the first phase of her 30% tax cut, which at that stage had now become quite famous or infamous if you listen to the editorials that surrounded them, not only was she going to cut taxes, but she was going to do the first phase, 5% retroactive. Now think about that for a moment. This woman is governor for about 15 minutes, and she proposes something that no one had ever proposed of and probably even thought could be done, which is cut an income tax, which had never been done in New Jersey up to that point, a state income tax, and to do it retroactively. She said it, and it was done. 3 months later in March, she signed the bill. So that by the time we got to the first budget address, she was already on the second part, the 10%, which got coined the middle class tax cut. So she was already halfway at her 30% by the time of her first full budget year. We look back now, we may say, oh, so what? But ladies and gentlemen, that was an extraordinary accomplishment. Whether you're male governor, female governor, that was an extraordinary accomplishment. And I think it really spoke to the fact, and I think John suggested this, the tax cut was not a slogan. The tax cut was a policy rationale that the governor thought could work, should work, and needed to work, because we really didn't have a lot of choices at that time. And John, I'm going to just respectfully disagree with you on one thing. I think luck does play a part of it, but I also think substance and vision plays a large part as well. And Mike Torpy said the commitment to stay with it. We're all being very polite here when we say there was some grousing when the governor announced his tax cut. Ladies and gentlemen, we were ridiculed. She was ridiculed. I mean, the language in these editorials was, my lawyer hat, nothing short of slanderous. I mean, that's how biting the criticism was of these tax cuts. And now looking back in hindsight, perhaps it suggests the early beginnings, forgive me, Mark, of the decline of influence of the print media. Because if all we had to go on were those editorials in September and October, Jim Flory would have easily been a two-term governor. So the message of the inaugural was promises made, promises kept, accelerate the pace of what needs to be a full economic plan, and lead by example. And she did all of that. The other point I just wanted to make is we were talking about the tax cut, and that really did become a shorthand reference to the first term agenda, but it was really more than just cutting taxes, and it was more than just cutting the income tax. It was cutting a number of taxes, and it was also providing jobs, promoting jobs, and economic growth, and lessening regulations, and doing all the things you need to do so the CEO of Merck doesn't get in his helicopter at night and fly to another state. All of that was wrapped up in as a short reference, a short-term reference to the tax cut. And the governor began on Inauguration Day. She began the first 15 minutes of her term, and she really never stopped. And I know we're just talking about the first term here, but later on in this series, and Dean Hughes had suggested this, the economic data really did bear out the success of the Whitman years. Now, it's very complex, as I said, so there's a lot to it, not just her policies, but certainly her policies helped. Certainly her policies made things easier in terms of economic growth and so forth. And I think that record is a very laudable one, and it speaks for itself. Last point on that theme, one of the criticisms that we heard in September of '93 when the governor announced this, and we heard it throughout our administration, was would these tax cuts at the end of the day, in hindsight, would they be a net plus or a net minus for the taxpayers? Would property taxes go up dollar for every dollar that went down in tax cuts? We heard that constantly. And I don't know whether Jim is going to touch on this later, but I would commend for anyone's attention the Manhattan Institute, Professor Goodspeed, a professor at Hunter College, has done a pretty extensive survey of this very question. Did the Whitman tax cuts result in a net gain or deficit for the New Jersey taxpayer? And he looked at all the available data, school aid and so forth, and his conclusion was pretty clear that the Whitman tax cuts and tax policies were a net benefit to the New Jersey taxpayer, and by a pretty decent margin. For me in the counsel's office, it was promises made, promises kept, and the inaugural speech was the first opportunity to show we were on the road to do that, and I think the governor did that.